Okay, so we're entering into our final session, everyone, with 4 more talks. And we're going to begin with a keynote from Chris Bailey from the, it's Chris Bailey, right?
Yes, yeah, thank
Excellent. Esquire?
you. Not yet.
Okay, I don't know what that means, so. From the Illinois College of Law, and he'll be talking about encoding civil procedure in the lien proof assistant.
Hell yeah.
Is that right? Great. So let's hear it for Chris Bailey.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm just kidding. All right. 45 minutes is a very long time for me to stand up here and talk to you about civil procedure. Usually you got to pay a lot of money for this kind of thing. If you have questions, just raise your hand or yell them out, and then I'll repeat them so people can hear them, and then we can just do that at any point. So our sort of research topic was looking at implementing civil procedure in some kind of computer system. We chose the lien proof assistant. It's also like a full-featured programming language. So it's really just sort of a programming language in which you can prove things, which is always nice. I am just curious. I'm going to do like a computer scientist, lawyer, both kind of thing. Computer scientists, raise your hands. Lawyers, raise your hand. Okay. Both. Consider some both. Yeah, let's go. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so what is civil procedure? Since we have a bunch of computer scientists in the room, civil procedure is well, I like to give them like a preview of what's coming, and yeah. No. This thing, right? Yeah. Cool. All right. So procedural rules dictate the manner in which a case or controversy actually moves through the courts, or sometimes doesn't move through the courts. You have a whole set of what are called procedural due process rights that tell you sort of what rights you have when you are before a court, if you ever find yourself there. They're actually very analogous to system calls and calling conventions, because they are the way that you request resources or actions from a court. They are sometimes nice in that they afford you these procedural due process rights. Sometimes they're not so nice because they're really very complicated, and the lines are really sharp because the consequences are quite serious. So what, I guess, is the main problem that we're trying to address? We can pretty much sum it up with these points. All non-criminal legal disputes are somewhere in the civil justice system. Civil is the non-criminal part. The procedural rules, they were sort of created and evolved under the assumption that all of the parties before the court will be represented by counsel. We know that that's not the case. I mean, just empirically, there are lots of people that come before federal courts that are not represented by counsel. There is no general right to counsel in civil matters. And the rules are too complex to allow you or anyone else to really represent themselves. If you want to get like the sort of timeless indictment of the whole thing, you can read this thing called See Why the Haves Come Out Ahead by Mark Gallanter. It's like 50 years old, but it's all still very true. So there's a bunch of statistical work that was done by this the Legal Services Corporation. It's a congressional nonprofit. I forget their exact title, but they did a big survey of sort of exactly who's experiencing legal problems in the United States relative to who's not being represented. Really a lot of low-income households experience civil justice matters. Almost 40% of people experience more than 5 legal problems. 1 in 5 experience more than 10. So common issues are consumer issues, healthcare, housing, income maintenance, those kinds of things. And more than half of those people said that those legal issues they faced substantially impacted their lives. So yeah, if you're in a lower income bracket in the US, it's very unlikely that you're going to have legal help from competent counsel when it comes to civil legal issues. And people who do consider going to find lawyers to help them, have cost as one of their primary concerns. Legal counsel is very expensive. Things take a very long time in the courts. I mean, drafting even a motion, doing it correctly is it's quite a lot of work, and it doesn't actually get you that far every time you do it. It's sort of a very slow crawl to the finish line here. Nowadays, it's sort of less crazy sounding for people that are in positions of authority or in positions to actually be heard by the establishment to just say there's a huge problem here. So the NCSC, which is another nonprofit that looks primarily at state courts, they have just said that this sort of system that we thought was running the civil justice system is not. Most people just they don't show up with legal assistance commensurate with their needs. The things that are at risk, you risk the default judgment being entered against you if you don't adequately respond to claims that are made against you. You can be subject to all kinds of bullying by people that do know the procedural rules really well. There's all kinds of underhanded tricks that people can do to hurt your chances of winning. You might have significant costs and delays. You might run into issues with the statute of limitations. If you don't know about these procedural rights you have and you don't know how to exercise them, you're probably going to forfeit them accidentally. You might get sanctioned by the court. So entries of default judgments are actually fairly common. Because we don't have really good sort of semantic tagging of data from courts, it's sometimes difficult to even really suss out exactly what the statistics mean. We do have somewhat of a window of opportunity here. Most surveys suggest that people who engage with state courts are willing to, they're actually seeking out better engagement with the courts by means of using technology. Lawyers have largely already adopted these solutions. They're using paid legal research services, Westlaw, Bloomberg, Lexis, that kind of thing. So just to recap really quickly, civil litigation is extremely powerful. If you look at the kinds of things that people who are active a lot in civil courts can achieve, it can be pretty breathtaking. The sort of complexity of the system that we live in is actually sort of ramping up. Just the direction our political economy is taking means that things are getting more complex. Multi-district and complex litigation has now sort of become the norm in federal courts. And it's unfortunate because a lot of these things go to very basic questions, sort of civics questions. Who are the doors of the federal courts open to and for what purposes? It would be nice if we had a much simpler answer to that. Just to go through a sort of case study, the Supreme Court in the sort of recent years, they've taken the sort of Mills Lane approach to civil procedure, which is protect yourself at all times, and you alone are responsible for knowing the rules when it comes to your case. So there's a case called Bowles v. Russell from 2007. Keith Bowles had a habeas petition in front of a federal court. They screwed up by failing to notify him that they had entered a final judgment in his case. When he went to file another habeas appeal to get past that initial error, the district court that was dealing with his case, they wrote down a deadline that was 17 days after the current date. The actual rule, the Federal Rule of Appellate Procedure, which is a mirror of Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 6, only gave him technically 14 days. So the district court judge wrote down the wrong date on his thing. They filed on the 16th day. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's too bad, you should have double checked. And they denied his appeal, and they decided that these kinds of issues are jurisdictional, which goes to another rule that says if at any time the court decides they don't have subject matter jurisdiction, they have to stop what they're doing. The whole thing's over. Don't pass go, don't collect $200. Do go back to jail, unfortunately, in this case. So this is currently the law of the land. Usually when you see something like this, if there's a dissent, this one was 5-4. The dissent is sort of couched in this tepid language about well, I respectfully disagree, and we have a different view of this technical issue, and Souter just said, this is bullshit. There's no reason for us to be doing this to people. This is not fair. Kind of another interesting point about this that if you're a nerd and you like looking at oral arguments for Supreme Court cases, part of the rule here, there's this weird 3-day mail provision that says if the thing you're dealing with is sent out by mail and it contains a deadline, you have an additional 3 days. And it's sort of colloquially known as the 3-day mail rule. This Paul Mancino Jr. was the attorney for the appellant in this case. So he's talking about how the 3-day mail rule is implicated in this case. So this is at issue here. And Justice Breyer says, what's the 3-day mail rule? Just a note, the Supreme Court is responsible for promulgating the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, and he has to ask what that is. That's not a good sign of how complex these are. So this was one of the first rules that we actually took a look at was Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 6, which talks about how deadlines and times to do things are calculated. The language mirrors this rule of appellate procedure. So we kind of had to start from way back at sort of first principles. We developed a date and time library in Lean that's available for general use. And from there, we implemented the algorithm that comprises this rule of civil procedure. In doing so, we discovered a couple of interesting things. This is going to be the case. If any of you get involved in like working with statutory law or anything like that, you will find just weird stuff because people are not, there's a big difference between, like a sort of pen and paper proof, and then when you go to mechanize it, you find a bunch of, things that you weren't thinking about originally. So one of the things that I would consider a bug, when you calculate the last date that your time period runs on, if it runs on a holiday or a day on which the clerk's office is closed, you get until the next day that is not a holiday or the clerk's office is closed. This computation is technically not well-founded. There's no limitation on states or the federal government or the president can declare any number of holidays they want. The district court could potentially logjam you by just saying the clerk's office is closed. So you can either just say it's partial, or you can require them to pass a proof that says, in this list of holidays, there's at least one day in any year that is not a holiday. So that one is actually, Lean has very nice features for decidability, so it's pretty easy to just say, if you give me the list of holidays, I'll figure out if there's one in there. There's another, this one I think is probably the most insidious one. This is really dumb. Dates can either be calculated forward or backward. So if the court says you have 30 days to do X, then you count the 30 days, and if it falls on a weekend or holiday, you get until the next one that is not. So you gain additional days. If what they say is this paper has to be filed no fewer than 14 days before Y, now you're counting backward. So if you count backward the 14 days, and that happens to be a Saturday, your due date is the Friday before. So you lose days that way. It's very unique. So another one is that they use local times in these federal rules. So depending on what kind of computer system you're using, you may or may not automatically get a conversion between the CST and CDT, which is daylight savings. There's also no time standard specified. In the time library that we were using, we obviously have to make a distinction between TAI and UTC and all these things. If the other lawyer is gone, but if the one lawyer remaining, if you ever have a case that turns on leap seconds, please call me because I would love to actually put that to use somewhere. There's another sort of looping thing here. This 3-day mail rule is applied after you do the adjustment for weekends and holidays. Then you apply this 3-day thing. There was a question, an open question, if the 3-day mail rule lands you on another weekend or holiday, what do you do after that? They actually clarified this in 2005. They put it in a little footnote down here. And unfortunately, they amended it when there was a 6E, and there's no longer a 6E, but that's still the footnote. This is always special. This is sort of another interesting drafting thing. So the way that law is written a lot of the times is kind of crazy. They will write something, and when they find that there's an error, they will write another thing that sort of patches it and just put them on the same page. So it's like if you wrote a function that computed dot product, and there was a bug in it, and you wrote a second function to correct the output of the first one, and then someone said, well, so what you do is you just compose these two, and then you get the right answer. Folks, we love it. This is just sort of a personal note from the time library that we wrote. Last year when I was here showing something, someone asked if there were dependent types that were in type and not parts of proofs. And now I can say, yes, there are. The time thing that we used actually has this cool thing where it's indexed by the SI power unit. So if you want a signed duration that's at the second precision, you have 0. If you want like milliseconds, you put the correct SI power. And then we get to derive these all the classes just once, and you get them for all. Yes? 4. Yeah. That was kind of hard too. I'll complain about working on things that are in development is really exciting. It can be frustrating. So the whole Rule 6 thing was just sort of an aside to talk about how sort of scary dealing with civil procedure in the wrong way can be. Just to go back to my first slide here. So the initial research goals for our group, I was very fortunate to be an intern last summer at Microsoft Research with Jonathan Partsenko and Leo Demura as well. They were amazing. The whole experience was really great. The research goals, sort of in a broad sense, if you had legal software that had a semantic awareness of the rules of civil procedure, there are plenty of things now that I'll go over in a second that have sort of a syntactic awareness of the rules. The other big thing is, how do we make it useful? How do we prevent it from just being like this artifact that you can go look at and like throw pennies into? We also wanted to facilitate sort of a combined arms approach to actually like making things useful. Formal reasoning obviously is very important. It's also getting harder and harder to deny the effectiveness of statistical methods, like AI and machine learning. Although I do think you probably do need to pair them in a way that is sort of makes sense out of the whole thing. So Professor Grimmelman last year in his keynote, he dedicated some time talking about how these notions are sort of complementary. Formal reasoning, if nothing else, can supply sort of definitions and terms and APIs that people who are interested in statistical learning can use to, make sense of all the data that they're getting. So the current state of the art is you can try your favorite search engine. This is probably not going to end well. Almost certainly you'll get a really thinly veiled ad. You'll say like, I'm being sued in federal court, help. And you'll find something that says, whether this suit can be taken care of by like a motion to dismiss depends on state and local rules. Jones and Smith Legal Services can help you with that. Talk to one of our chatbots. If you're lucky, you might find the Cornell Legal Information Institute, and you can go read a bunch of statutory law. In the public sector, so entities like uscourts.gov and various district court websites, they provide things like forms and, like I was saying, resources that are syntactically aware of what you're supposed to be doing, kind of. So they're absolutely better than nothing. We would like to help improve those, but they don't really have the semantic awareness. The same thing is sort of true for these legal research services. They have sort of the same thing, but more detailed, and they're sort of maintained more actively by groups of experts. The bright side that we can take from these things that are state of the art is that we don't have to break entirely new ground. There's already people that recognize we can make money or we can deliver value by having these things, even if they are very labor intensive. If you'll look on, like these things by Westlaw, they have these pretty large checklists and they're extremely varied, so they probably have one for each state. You know, if you need to look up like a checklist of things that I need to include in like a deposition subpoena for any state, they'll have them, and they'll have these little marks that say maintained. So there are people that are, you know, dedicating time and effort to maintaining just this one resource. And if you look at, this is also sort of adopted already by the public sector. There's this thing called the Chief Counsel Code and Subject Matter Directory. So the IRS has this giant army of lawyers that are dedicated to one particular section of the Internal Revenue Code. And that's their job, is just to be like, I am the house expert on the section about non-business bad debts, right? Like the Wizard of Oz for like the least fun things in the world. So this is also like, if there was a will to actually sort of do this for civil procedure, you know, these people would probably, some of them would be computer scientists ideally if we were doing something like this. But we don't have to like create a new branch of the federal government to get motion on this. However, you know, these things, they do still require a bunch of developer time. It is difficult. A lot of people that speak here talk about this sort of isomorphism between like, we want the code to look like the law. I agree that to the extent that's possible, we should always go for that. It is tough. It's hard. So I think just to look at, in practice, what you get from the sort of available state of the art, we can look at the pro se pleading forms that are available on the US Courts website. These are the main rules we're going to be looking at. Rule 3, these are prefaced by Federal Rule of Civil Procedure, Rule X. Commencing action is done by filing a complaint with the court. You have to state your claim for relief if you have a bunch of claims. There are more complex rules that say that you can have as many claims as you want against as many parties. You can have claims in the alternative, dependent claims. And then Rule 12 is the one, or 12H3, says that if at any time they discover they lack this particular kind of jurisdiction called subject matter jurisdiction, you got to kick it out. And that applies to the whole thing. Subject matter jurisdiction, one of the big things we looked at was this diversity jurisdiction rule, which is this insane algorithm for determining whether or not you can go before a federal court. One of the judges who had a hand in formulating the way that it currently exists said that he regrets it. It's not great. So addressing these things, this is part of the venue requirement, which is actually 28 U.S.C. Section 1391 is the venue thing. This is just to show that the lack of semantic awareness means that you can file in non-existent places. The Green Division of the Central District of Illinois does not exist. The basis for jurisdiction section, so they do give you the options of federal question or diversity of citizenship. The explanation they give you for diversity of citizenship is just like woefully inadequate. Like there are large swaths of diversity suits that are not covered by the description they give you. In fairness, like, you know, what are you gonna do? It's super complicated. You can't have people filling out like reams of forms to determine whether they fit it within this really complex parameter. So questions that are not brought up, these again become immediately obvious. Like when you go to draft it in a computer, you have to start thinking about these things and you want answers to these questions. What is a citizen of a state? So this section 1332, which is the diversity one, asks all these questions. It talks about citizens of a state. It just says states. Are Puerto Rico and DC states? Who knows? There are different kinds of entities. Is it a corporation? Is it a partnership? Is it an LLC, S Corp, C Corp? When do you test state citizenship? So the form explicitly mentions, citizen of a state. Are they asking about when the thing happened that I'm suing about, or are they asking about when I'm filing out the form? They actually don't mention venue anywhere on the pro se form. That's a sort of key part of having your thing heard. They don't discuss how you actually value something like injunctive relief for the amount of controversy requirement. The answer form they give, which is another form, has sort of similar issues. I guess speed up here. This is, if you want to go look it up, Page versus Democratic National Committee is sort of a very recent, high-profile one in which there's this massive argument about how exactly do we apply this particular subset of these diversity cases where someone is a stateless entity in a partnership. So if you're suing a partnership, in order to determine the diversity of citizenship, you have to recurse through all members of the partnership. If they are themselves partnerships or corporations, you have to apply those tests. It's very difficult to do, not that bad with a computer. And so if you screw up any of these things, those are grounds for dismissal. The filing fee in federal court is $400. There's no general tolling statute at the federal level. It's hard to get a court date a lot of times. So to address at least some of these sort of venue questions, we have another thing called US Courts that provides a type-safe API for these courts, so you will not be filing in non-existent divisions or districts or whatever else. This was one of the things that we wanted to do, and in large part we did. I would like to make some improvements. How do we describe some of these things formally? Like a big part of, if you look at like the MathLib is the big mathematics library for Lean. They're really big on definitions. How do we set the parameters of like these things we're describing, right? What is a party? How do we describe claims between parties in ways that make sense? The federal rules use these terms very loosely in a way that's kind of hard to pin down. The deeper you get into it, you can put a formal description to it that can capture all of these different uses. Ours it's essentially just a big graph. It's a weighted directed graph. So like if A has a claim against B, that's an edge between two nodes. The edge weights are things like causes of action and claims for relief. So like I said, a lot of these things just sort of fall out in drafting. Some examples of other stuff that we found while drafting some of these laws. This is a really fun one that I wish I had more time to get into. They're really bad about saying state when what they actually want to address is states, territories, and federal districts. The Rule 6 Infinite Holidays thing. Dismissals, they're really sloppy with the way that they discuss dismissals. There's a particular example of that I have. Here it is. Yeah. So this Rule 41 says that plaintiffs can voluntarily dismiss an action without a court order by filing a certain piece of paper. There's actually a circuit split now on whether this means you have to dismiss the entire action or whether you can dismiss just one claim from the action or a party. When we have this sort of more granular like graph representation underlying it, it's really easy to just talk about those things, but because they didn't, we're stuck with these sorts of ambiguities. So in terms of the research goals that we had, so the last thing I wanted to mention is a lot of these things we analyzed sort of in isolation, and we came up with sort of nice ways to discuss them, and we can demonstrate properties about them and get useful answers. Sort of the prize is composition. We want to say like, okay, these are all components of what we're dealing with here, whether it's like parties or claims or jurisdiction. How do we start composing those things? So the first attempt was to look at the docket of a civil action as a sort of program. If you don't know what a docket is, if you go on any sort of like Court Listener is probably the best free one. You can go look at like, I'm going to look at this civil action and see what's going on. The docket entries are a sequential list of like actions and filings in a civil action. So like 1 says complaint was filed. 2 is sort of a weird entry. 3, the case is assigned, attorneys appear. It's sort of a sequential list of like, this happens, and this happens, and this happens. So what we wanted to do is treat the docket entries as a sequence of commands, like a program. We have the state of the civil action as the state as you would have in a programming language semantics. And then the procedural rules are the sort of reduction steps that would be allowed by the semantics. So think of a big step, operational semantics. Operational, or we're not really dealing with like super low level details. So just this basic outline of, you have an initial state and you have a computation. Through some application of rules, it ends up at some terminal state, right? So in our case, it's, you have the state and the docket, and then they end up in some terminal state. If someone tries to do something that is contrary to the rules, then your reduction relation gets stuck the same way that you would in sort of a normal semantics. And then you can derive sort of from this step relation version, you get a functional evaluator that just errors out if you are doing something bad. I'm going to drink of water real quick, and then I'll talk about why that didn't actually work. So the big thing that sort of threw a wrench in that, even though like you can do that, you can write that, and it's neat. I tried out for and made it onto the University of Illinois Federal Civil Rights Clinic. This is a program started by Judge Harold Baker to relieve congestion from 1983 cases. They pick 8 students once a year, and 4 teams of 2 are assigned a 1983 case. And you bring it all the way to a jury trial. So you go from like the initial stage of the case to trying it in front of a jury. This is basically everybody's first experience. Like, I'm litigating in a federal district court. I'm dealing with a judge and filing motions and doing discovery disputes. And you very quickly find out that A, you're worthless, and B, people do stuff that is not strictly legal all the time. Like, that's just the way it is. You really have to be fault tolerant when you're doing this stuff. So as an example of something that like makes sense on paper when you read the black letter law, and when you try and do this sort of naive semantic model, you just totally screwed. So Rule 4 basically just says that if you file a complaint, you have to serve a defendant with process within 90 days. And if you don't do that, it's going to get dismissed. The question is, when the 90 days is actually up, and you haven't served the defendant, what happens? Let's say there's 3 defendants. You haven't served any of them, right? At the 90th day plus 1 second, a computer doesn't kick on in, some mountain fort in Virginia and just like dismiss all the defendants. It doesn't do that. They're not going to get dismissed. The judge, you might see a new docket entry that he wants to have like a scheduling conference. They might file a motion first to try and get it dismissed. Nothing might happen. And instead, you just have to mark it as like, well, this might be grounds for an appeal if I'm the defendant later on. So that sort of, yeah.
If I'm a defendant and the court doesn't serve me within 90 days, can I just use that and leverage that for the thing to just get the case dismissed?
Yeah, you would file a motion. So it's in here somewhere. Yeah, the court, on motion or on its own after notice of the plaintiff, must dismiss the action without prejudice. It's sort of another problem. It's like, okay, you file the motion and they just don't do that, right? They're not going to say like, screw Rule 4M, but they have other things to do and they're trying to get all this stuff done. The judge is talking to the clerk. They're trying to get all of these cases scheduled and taken care of. They might first want to talk to the plaintiff and see if they have a good reason for being late. Maybe they're going to try and, argue that you're not actually subject to service of process in the US, so therefore the time rule doesn't apply. But this sort of gets to the more important point, I think, is that how do we work within that realization? We don't know everything, right? What if there are multiple defendants? The rule doesn't really address that. What if I file a complaint and then I amend it 30 days in? Do I get a whole new 90-day period? I asked that to like 3 or 4 lawyers. The best response I just got was, well, that would be highly unusual. It's like, well, yeah, but I still want to know what happens. The thing is, though, that we do know enough to give people really valuable feedback. If you are someone that filed a complaint in a federal district court, and you haven't told me explicitly that your defendant is subject to one of these exceptions, we know that you should probably serve them with process within 90 days, right? That's a safe assumption. The question now becomes, how do we use this without just saying like, well, it's all just heuristics then? And if you're a defendant, if you are being sued, a lot of times people find out that they're being sued without actually being sued in process. If you haven't been served within 90 days, we can't just say, well, you've won. You know, there's still stuff you have to do. It might not work out entirely in your favor, but we would like to be able to tell you, like, listen, you can get a massive advantage. The best move you can do at this point is to file this motion to dismiss. Time constraints prevent me from going over that in more detail. So, you know, learning from our mistakes of, I'll be nice to myself and I'll say, learning in the light of real world experience of like these sort of controlled chaos of federal litigation. A couple of things. Long range inferences, the kind that you would usually take from this sort of like very nice semantic model that you can like step through the whole thing, not actually that useful. What you have at any given time is like, let's say, you know, time t, right? And there's this state, the parties are going to do a bunch of stuff, and then the authority presiding over the case, which is a judge or a magistrate or whoever else, they're just going to tell you what the post state should be in the real world, right? But you do have a bunch of like really good guesses you can make based on the rules. And if nothing else, if the post state they give you doesn't comport with the rules, your rules can tell you that, you know, you should probably start thinking about this as grounds for appeal maybe, or call the judge, maybe you need to get something cleared up. So we're actually not as interested as I originally thought in getting like really long range inferences. We also, you know, I wrote a bunch of this stuff to sort of like, here's the correct answer. If you give me like 100 different parties, you're suing the largest 3 partnerships in the United States, here's the diversity jurisdiction analysis. Even if it's the right answer, you can't just give me the right answer because it's terrifying to look at that. Even if it has been like, you know, verified relative to some specification. I want to know your reasoning. I want to know like alternatives. Just show me the whole like execution trace, all the different paths it could have taken. More information is usually going to be better from the user's perspective. Assigning these sort of like deterministic consequences, as in the Rule 4M thing, is really going to be very difficult, but again, not that high in terms of utility. What we would really rather have is like the simple thing. Give me the simple thing of like, you gotta serve the defendant within 90 days. And then also, there's a low value in hindsight on really correctly determining the outcome of any given step because it's gonna be given to you. The judge will tell you what he wants to do. It's not a mystery. So you will get this information eventually and in enough time to like do something useful with it. So it's not all bad. It's just that like we thought it was this and it's actually sort of this direction that we want to go. Yes?
A quick question. Wasn't there a recent case that got thrown out on diversity jurisdiction from federal court after going all the way to the Supreme Court?
Probably, because that happens all the time. Okay. Like diversity jurisdiction is one of these ones that like really, they will have cases that have gone for like years and years and years, and they'll just say like, they didn't have jurisdiction over this. So I'm sure you're right, yeah. So the sort of closing remark, the model that we're going with now is that all of the parties involved in a civil action have just a score, right? If you want to go like a unit score, we'll say like -1 to +1. We're only thinking about one state at a given time, and application of the rules just gives us a new set of deltas for scores. So if you've done something bad, it's usually pretty easy for us to say that like, this is bad and this is good. You just get a bunch of new scores that correspond to new information. as opposed to having like a precise set of consequences that you get. Under this new understanding that like the starting and ending state in reality are going to be given to you by the facts. What we're interested in is like these sort of speculative positions of like, well, what can we or should we be looking at from this point in time?
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
do you have a final slide to wrap up real quick?
Yeah, I do. I want to complain about law school for 1 second. One of the reasons why probably you have a hard time finding like interdisciplinary people to study with, the way that law school works in post-graduation employment, there's sort of this diminishing returns thing. It's like a sigmoid curve. Like the more time you spend, you get more and more and more expertise. This is probably like a balanced outcome, right? Law school wants you like as far on this end as possible because like being one rank higher in your class rank is going to get you like better employment outcomes. If we want to encourage more sort of interdisciplinary study, you know, if anyone listening to this or in the room is involved in legal employment, like maybe putting less emphasis on this and like, you know, who's doing interesting things that could potentially add value to our practice outside of, you know, getting that one additional class rank or whatever would be good. There's also this sort of difference in people's like time horizons for publishing research and everything. But yeah, so we had a lot of success in analyzing like particular questions and interesting things and finding bugs. Compositionality is sort of the thing that we'll be more interested in going forward. But yeah, thank you very much.